Hello and welcome to Know Your Rights, the Disabled Girl's Guide to College. My name is Stephanie Woodward and I'm the Executive Director of Disability Empower Network. We're an organization run by and for girls, women, and feminine-aligned people with disabilities to help give you the skills and confidence to lead. Today's training is brought to you by the New York Bar Foundation. I'm excited to jump in and talk to you about your rights as a college student. And first, I just want to acknowledge that going to college is a scary and an exciting time for everybody. But it can be especially scary and exciting for students with disabilities who may have to advocate for their rights for the first time on their own. So this training is meant to give you a quick tutorial about some disability rights that you should know about as college students. There are 3 laws that you should be aware of just as a primer. The first is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I will be calling the ADA. The second is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which I'm going to call Section 504. And the third is the Fair Housing Amendments Act, which I'm going to call the Fair Housing Act. And I'm really going to be focusing on the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 today. But there are some rights that you should know about when it comes to housing for college students, and that would be within the Fair Housing Act. So jumping right in, the ADA makes it illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities in public and private sectors. And that includes higher education, which means public and private colleges and universities cannot discriminate against students with disabilities. However, the ADA does have an exemption for religious entities, which means if you go to a school that is a strict religious school, then they might be exempt from the ADA. But they might not, depending on if they receive different funding, they might not be exempt from Section 504. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act prohibits any entity receiving federal financial assistance from discriminating against individuals with disabilities. And since most higher education institutions somehow accept federal financial dollars, most higher education institutions do fall under Section 504 and are required to follow Section 504 laws, meaning that they cannot discriminate against students with disabilities because of the fact that they accept those federal funds. And this can include those religious schools. So if you go to a religious school that accepts financial funding that is federal, then they would be subject to Section 504. But how do you know if you are covered by these laws? How do you know if you're covered by the ADA or by Section 504? You are covered if you are considered a qualified individual with a disability. The term individual with disability is a specific term that is defined within the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'm not going to go over what the definition of a person with a disability is. I'm going to go over the term qualified, because generally people know if they are a person with a disability. But a qualified person with a disability means that you are capable of completing the college program with or without reasonable modifications or reasonable accommodations. So what are some examples of discrimination under the ADA or Section 504 in the college atmosphere? Discrimination can include denying admission to students with disabilities on the basis of their disability, steering a student with a disability down a more restrictive career path, excluding that student from specific courses, and failing to provide reasonable accommodations or auxiliary aids, which could be in the coursework, in the classroom setting, in physical environments. It can also include interpreters and other forms of accessible communication. Let's talk about examples of reasonable modifications or auxiliary aids. These really aren't specifically listed out anywhere. There really isn't a specific list of accommodations that a student can request, but I will give you a few examples of things that you could think about that might work for you. So some examples can include a student who uses a mobility aid could request that a table be put into the classroom instead of a desk because it would be difficult for them to use a desk. It could be not assessing penalties for spelling errors for students with dyslexia. It might be providing materials in Braille or electronic format for students with vision-related disabilities. It might be allowing course substitutions, providing qualified sign language interpreters, providing note takers, or even allowing extra time on exams. So there isn't really a specific list of accommodations that are out there, but there are ways for you to think about what may work for you, or perhaps what has worked for you in the past, and request those accommodations. And remember that the accommodations process can be like a negotiation going back and forth. But how do you get an accommodation? Schools are only required to provide accommodations for students that they are aware have disabilities and are in need of accommodations. So you must make your school aware of your disability and formally request those accommodations, because they can't provide accommodations to students that they don't know need those accommodations. Every school is different. So you want to look for how your school does things. A general rule that I start with is looking for your school's disability services office. That is often a great place to start. You may be able to request your accommodations directly through them. If your school does not have a disability services office, I recommend talking to the dean of students or to your academic advisor. And when you make your request for an accommodation, I strongly recommend that you make that request in writing and include the following information. Number 1, identify yourself and identify that you are a person with a disability. Number 2, identify how your disability affects you in school. Number 3, identify the accommodations that you need. And number 4, identify how the accommodation will help you. At the close of your accommodation request, you should include a deadline that you expect to receive a response to your request. Your deadline should be reasonable, such as within 1 to 2 weeks, unless there is something urgent, in which case you might want to expedite your deadline. And if you don't receive a response within that time, then you should treat that lack of response as a denial and begin the appeal process, because you don't want to be waiting forever for an accommodation that you need, but you do want to give them an appropriate amount of time to consider it and get back to you. And I will get into the appeals process a little bit later into this training. But let's take a minute to talk about documentation. Some people need documentation for their reasonable accommodation requests. Sometimes, not always. Every school is different and each request is different. If your disability is obvious and your request is obviously related to your disability, then you likely do not need to submit documentation with your request. For example, when I was in law school, I specifically requested that I be assigned to classrooms that were fully accessible, fully wheelchair accessible. There were some classrooms that had wheelchair lifts, and that, while the wheelchair lifts technically make the room accessible, they're incredibly loud, and I would never want to be in a situation where I was running late to class and had to take a very loud machine in order to get into my classroom and disturb the rest of the class. Or what if I just had to go to the bathroom in the middle of class? I would have had to disturb the entire class just to get in and out of the room. And I just didn't want to do that. I didn't want to make a spectacle of myself. So my disability was obvious. I'm a wheelchair user. My request was obviously related to my disability. I wanted wheelchair accessible rooms that did not require a lift to get in. Therefore, I did not submit any documentation with my request because my disability is obvious. The reason for the request is obviously related to that disability. However, there are some situations where either your disability is not obvious, and in those cases, you might need documentation for your disability. And in other cases, the request you are making may not obviously be related to your disability. So in those cases, you may need documentation as well. For example, if a student has dyslexia and needs extra time for tests, that is not always a disability that is obvious to the school. So the school may request documentation in order to demonstrate the disability or in order to demonstrate that the accommodation being requested relates to the disability. If your school does request documentation, ask exactly what documentation they will need. A school can request proof of disability and the need for an accommodation, but the school cannot request so much documentation that it become overly burdensome and prevent the student with a disability from actually ever getting to their reasonable accommodation. So be sure to ask what they need and be sure that it is not overly burdensome. But what happens if your school refuses to provide you with a reasonable accommodation, or they discriminate against you in some other way because of your disability? In those cases, you have multiple options. First, you can appeal within your school. Second, you can file a complaint with the Department of Education or the Department of Justice. Or third, you may consider filing a lawsuit. Also, if you live in New York State, you can consider filing a complaint through the Division of Human Rights. Now, right now, with the federal government, we are currently in 2025, and the Department of Education is in a questionable circumstance. So if you're unclear on whether the Department of Education is the right path for you, please consider going through the Department of Justice or going through New York State. If you are watching this training from another state, please look up if your state has a human rights law. If it does, this may be an applicable situation where you go through your human rights law. So in order to appeal within your school, you have to figure out what your school's internal appeals processes are. You may want to look into your student handbook to find out what the grievance procedures are. And I recommend filing your complaint as soon as possible, but no later than 180 days from when the denial or from when the discrimination occurred. When you file your complaint, include all of the details that you can, including the times, the dates, the locations, the people that you spoke with, the things that were said, the discrimination that occurred. Also include any witnesses or any documentation that you might have, such as those emails. Remember, I told you to put your accommodation request in writing. I think that anytime you have any sort of interaction about your disability or discrimination or accommodations, whether or not your interaction happens in writing, it's always good to follow up in writing. So if you had a face-to-face meeting where things were agreed upon, follow that up with an email saying, hey, we met today and here's what we discussed. That's going to be helpful if you ever need documentation for the future. Now, to file a complaint on the federal level, you need to first determine what entity would be appropriate. In this case, if you are seeking to go to the Department of Justice because the Department of Education is downsizing, then the Department of Education the Department of Justice would investigate complaints that often fall under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you go to a state school and the Department of Education doesn't seem like a good path for you at the time, please consider your local human rights law, whether that's a Department of Human Rights, a Division of Human Rights. Every state calls it something a little bit different. To file a complaint, go to their website. So the Department of Justice has a website, and state entities also have websites. So in New York State, the Division of Human Rights does have its own website with its own complaint form. The third option, outside of appealing within your school or going to a federal or state entity, is to file a lawsuit. If you want to consider filing a lawsuit, you first want to find an attorney that would best represent you. To find that attorney, you first want to gather the same information that you would put into a complaint so that all of those details that you have, such as time, location, the discrimination, any documents that you have, you can bring those to attorneys when you discuss your case. There are time limits to filing lawsuits, and these are called the statute of limitations. So be sure to reach out to an attorney in a timely manner if you want to consider filing a lawsuit. And nothing prohibits you from doing all of these things at the same time. You can file a grievance, file a complaint with the Department of Justice, and reach out to an attorney all at the same time. Is there anything that you can do to protect yourself from discrimination in a college setting? Yes. The first step is to know your rights, and you've done that just by learning a little bit more here today. But another thing you can do is have great documentation. Take notes when you have those meetings and access accommodations. Write down when, where, who you're talking to. Keep copies of those emails and correspondences. Keep accommodation requests that you submit. If you experience any access issues that you can record on video or in pictures or in writing, then do that. This information can help you if you experience discrimination in the future. I hope this training has been helpful for you. And if it has, please hit the like button and share with others who may be able to benefit. If you'd like to know more about the Disabled Girls Guide to College, please visit us at disabilityempowerhernetwork.org. That's disabilityempowerhernetwork.org.